Okay, dear colleagues, shall we start? I would like to introduce you Dr. Richarda Vайтца. He's a senior fellow and director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at Hudson Institute. And today he will give us a lecture about the Russian-US dialogue on nuclear disarmament in the context of current bilateral relations crisis. So, the dialogue on strategic security and nuclear disarmament has always been a top topic in Russia-US relations. And recently, it's became maybe even more so because at the point both countries are looking for some new ways of cooperation, and some recent decisions kind of put to question the existing mechanisms, such as, for instance, the decision of Russia to suspend Russia's deal on plutonium. So it changed the context quite a lot. And, Dr. Vайтца will give us the lecture, and then we'll have time for discussion. I'll transfer the word to Dr. Vайтца. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Do I need should I hold this? Okay. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, yes. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm a director at an analytical center inside the Hudson Institute. It's a Moscow Center, a Russian, it's equivalent to a Russian think tank, but there's a lot more in Washington. Ours has a strong history in the area, as you know, of nuclear issues and Russia-U.S. relations, or even Soviet-U.S. relations. I'm, however, speaking in a personal capacity, and so I want to thank some groups. But again, I want to thank the Russian Council for hosting me. I want to thank the Valdai Foundation for bringing me to Russia. I want to thank the MacArthur Foundation for supporting my research in Russia, U.S., and includes China as well, U.S. security, but non-proliferation issues. And the U.S. Embassy for helping me with the visit here. But again, I'm giving my remarks in my own capacity. I'm going to speak for maybe 20-30 minutes, and I'll speak in English. But I разучился говорить на русском языке, все еще понимаю. So I remember enough Russian that I can understand if you want to make a question or a comment in Russian. I just haven't spoken it in a while, so I'm not comfortable actually giving the whole presentation in Russian. And so what I'm going to do is, and you're welcome to ask questions or make comments. I'm here actually to learn and get a sense of what people here in Russia are thinking. And the council is always very good, and then it's a neutral point of view. And so I get a representative range of views on these issues, which is really helpful. I spoke here in March, and I learned a lot. I'm going to talk a bit about the general issue of the state of the arms control treaties between Russia and the U.S. I'm going to talk about some of the nuclear security questions, which we just briefly mentioned in the introduction. I'll talk about some of the regional issues, particularly the non-proliferation challenges in Iran and North Korea. And then I'll talk a bit in the end, probably just mention a bit about the U.S. elections, but we can talk about all these issues or other things in more detail going forward. Just as background, as we all remember, the Soviet-U.S. relationship has always been defined as this is one of its core principles. The state of non-proliferation was always an area that, even in the depth of the Cold War, or something that Moscow and Washington could often agree was sufficiently important to warrant cooperation. We saw a lot of agreements during the Cold War, and we saw more towards the end and afterwards. Now, the overall relationship has had its ups and downs, but it's primarily been for other factors, regional security issues, differences over domestic politics, even perhaps personality clashes over time. And we haven't been able to totally shield the Russia-U.S. partnership on non-proliferation or arms control from these effects. And I think that's true now, and that has been true previously, with as you remember, at the end of the Carter administration, the U.S. government gave up on an arms control treaty that it couldn't get ratified through the Senate. And so this is an important issue, but it's unlike, say, the U.S.-China relationship, where there are a lot of other issues going on at the same time, so that you can have setbacks in one and progress in the other, and it balances here. This is still the core of the relationship between Russia and the United States, these kind of issues. We might as well begin with the good news, which is that so far we have not seen any problems in implementation in the main arms control agreement between Russia and the United States. That's the New START treaty. It builds on some of the earlier agreements we saw during the Cold War. This framework limits the number of warheads that the United States and Russia can put on their strategic delivery vehicles. Those are their ballistic missiles, their long-range airplanes, bombers, and their strategic submarines. And the latest agreement was a bit of a compromise between the earlier Cold War era START type agreements, or going back even further, the SALT agreement, basically which there was extensive verification, there were lengthy treaties, long limits, and the shorter treaty that the United States and Russia adopted in the Bush administration in 2003, which was more focused basically just on numbers of limits without much detailed verification. I think both countries felt that they didn't need an elaborate Cold War era construct, but they weren't comfortable just with a simple declaration of intent, so they sort of compromised. The current agreement is specific in the number of warheads that each side will have, about 1550, and there's some rules about how many can be on different types of systems and what their current state is. And there's some verification. There's a lot of data exchanges. There are 18 on-site inspections, and those. So far, both governments have implemented the treaty, whose limits don't actually take effect for a while, but they're heading towards those limits, and probably are now below them in both cases. And there's not been any accusation of cheating or non-execution of the agreement. But that said, there is a lot of uncertainty over where we'll go next. This treaty was originally designed as sort of at least the Obama administration came into office and saw this as something they had to negotiate very quickly because the previous agreement had expired and they wanted to keep some kind of arms control framework, but they really wanted to proceed as soon as possible to a more comprehensive agreement, which would cut systems more and make other be more constraining. But this treaty took longer than people thought to negotiate. It took a lot longer and was much more contested in terms of ratification in the U.S. Senate. And we've never got around, before the relationship deteriorated for other reasons, to dealing with the more comprehensive agreement that the Obama team said it wanted. And it looks like now we will not see that treaty until the New START agreement expires in about 4 or 5 years from now. There is a fundamental difference between the way that Russia and the United States under their current administrations wants to go. I would simplify it to say that the United States wants to go down. The United States government under the Obama administration thinks 1550 warheads on strategic forces is more than we both need. That 1,000 is a number that the U.S. military has said it can comfortably accommodate in its current war plans. And that would mean perhaps cutting our forces by a third overall and more proportional reductions. The U.S. has also tried to reduce or put some constraints on some other types of nuclear warheads, those that belong to so-called non-strategic or tactical systems. These are typically seen as delivery systems that are short-range missiles or that could be launched from strike aircraft, bomber aircraft. And there was a desire to somehow put, which we've never been able to do yet, is put some controls on the number of warheads directly, as opposed to trying to limit the number that were on their delivery system. And these would include warheads that are under repair or in storage and so on. And they're thought to be several thousand more than unemployed systems. So we thought to have between 4,000 and 5,000 warheads each. The Russian government, however, wants to go not down so much as out or broader. They say that we need to start addressing a lot of issues that we have not addressed directly in these bilateral strategic arms talks. And so the kind of questions they are interested in is, one, the well-known problem about strategic defenses. Their argument is that if we continue to cut the offensive forces of both sides, what each side has then for strategic defenses become more important in terms of their ability to affect any kind of calculations, and therefore there need to be addressed in some arms control agreement, if not in a New START treaty, then in some kind of associated agreement. And the Russian government in the past has called for limits on the numbers of missile defenses each side has, their location, their capabilities, and their movement. And so far the United States has, at least under the Obama administration, resisted this, just because the U.S. argues these systems are still too ineffective and not designed to be able to interfere with the strategic nuclear forces of Russia or China or any advanced nuclear power. They're really designed and capable at most of being able to intercept a few missiles launched from Iran or North Korea or some other minor nuclear power that didn't have the sophisticated arsenals that Russia and the United States did. And the U.S. also uses these a bit for conventional defenses as well, as we saw during the Gulf War. Another issue that the Russian government would want to capture in going out is that of other countries' nuclear forces. That's clearly the hundreds of warheads that France and Britain are thought to have. The Soviet government during the Cold War and Russia before has always wanted to address these, with the argument being that that Russia can't calculate the strategic balance just by looking at the Russia-U.S. balance. It needs to take into account at least Britain and France, since these are NATO countries, and therefore they could be used in any scenario, and Russia needs to be compensated, or somehow that concern needs to be addressed. It also seems to include China. The Russian-China relationship, we know, is very complicated, and so Russia doesn't explicitly demand that China's forces be limited, but Russian analysts and Russian proposals for future arms control would seem to put China as one of the countries whose forces need to be considered in any future reduction, and that could include formal participation in a multilateral arms agreement. Maybe it could include something a little less formal. It's not clear, and I consider it likely that the effort to multilateralize would require dealing with nuclear weapons of India or Pakistan or North Korea, or if they have any, Israel. And so the thinking is more it's focused on the 5 recognized nuclear powers of the Security Council. But so far, those countries have always objected to being included. They and the U.S. government basically shares the view that the Russian and U.S. forces need to come down more before we need to address the nuclear arsenal of these other countries. The Russian government has also said it wants to cover additional types of weapons that are not necessarily nuclear weapons, but could influence the nuclear exchange. Those particularly be advanced conventional weapons, high precision, very quick moving weapons, such as if the U.S. were to put conventional weapon on top of a strategic missile, as has sometimes been discussed, or a hypersonic vehicle. And there's also at times a consideration being given to what the U.S. has in Europe in terms of drones, or even the shorter range nuclear systems that the U.S. has through NATO's nuclear sharing agreement. Russia acknowledges it has many more of these smaller, shorter range weapons. The tactical nuclear weapons are non-strategic, but the Russian argument is they're all based inside Russia, whereas the U.S. systems are based in NATO, and so it's not a foreign country. And so the differences are pretty stark, and it's not clear. I mean, I think the U.S. path is pretty clear. You just cut them more. The Russian path is more complicated in that you'd have to figure out some way in which you trade off different types of systems to get a balance. In principle, it's possible, but it's going to require a more complicated agreement and a greater effort. And so that's basically the stalemate we've seen for the last 4 or 5 years in the Russia-U.S. dialogue at that level. There are some other complications that have been coming in. As you know, Russia and the United States under Gorbachev, and then the Soviet government under and then Ronald Reagan came to an agreement about the INF, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces. That INF treaty was something signed between Moscow and Washington. It covered the former Soviet republics, but nobody else. So it was just the Soviet Union and the United States. They agreed not to deploy ground-based missiles of a range of between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. This grew out of a Cold War NATO European-focused dispute in which Russia was modernizing some of these systems, and NATO felt it either had to modernize its own or, as it preferred, just to eliminate them. And the negotiations basically decided in favor of elimination, and it gave a lot of impetus to the subsequent improvement in Russia-U.S. relations. But now this INF treaty is in trouble. The U.S. government has said that Russia has violated the treaty, and the violation, it's a bit unclear how the magnitude, just because the U.S. hasn't revealed its sources. It's been reaffirmed as even today that they think that the Russian government is testing a missile, is designed and has tested a missile of this length, and may deploy it, although it's not been deployed yet. The Russian government has denied this, and it is possible that the dispute, it's not about a prohibited weapon. If the system is designed for use on an airplane or a ship, then it's acceptable. The treaty only covers land-based missiles. But the U.S. says, no, it looks like a land-based missile, but it can't tell Russia the proof it has, because it would reveal how the U.S. is finding this out. So and so if it's a technical means or a person who's giving this information, the U.S. doesn't want to expose that, and so Russia can deny this is taking place because the U.S. can't provide proof, and from this deadlock. However, Russia, since the U.S. started accusing it of violating the treaty, said that the U.S. is actually violating the treaty, citing the U.S. drone program. The U.S. does have unmanned vehicles that have this length between the 500 and 5,500 kilometer prohibited length, but they're not like cruise missiles in the sense that the drones go out and then they come back, but they are like cruise missiles that carry weapons. So the treaty exempts them, but Russia said they actually should fall within the treaty. Russia has also expressed concern that the U.S. is actually launching missiles of this range to test its IBM system on. And the third concern from the Russian government is that the ballistic missile defenses that the United States has placed in Europe could be used to launch missiles of these length with some reconfiguration. And the U.S. says it's never tested that, and it'd be difficult to do, but it's unclear how much of a concern this is. But the thinking's, the Russian government has still said it wants to support, it will try and implement the INF treaty, But there's a more fundamental objection that the Russian government has been making for the last 10 years in that this treaty only affects Russia and the United States, really. Now, it covers the other former Soviet republics, but they're not pursuing this missile, this range. But that exempts pretty much every other country in the world. And since when the treaty was signed in '87, during the last 3 decades, we got to a point now where before it was just the United States and the Soviet Union plus some of their allies that had weapons of these length. Now everybody that is a major power is getting them, and that these countries tend to be located around Russia. So the treaty in application is burdening Russia more. I mean, the Russians can point to China, South Korea, Iran, Pakistan, India, some of the Arab states. I mean, many countries have developing missiles of this length as their means for delivering conventional and warheads, and perhaps nuclear. So the Russian government is pushing either to include other countries in this treaty or, reconsider it. And so far, the two governments tried to extend it. There was little interest in Britain, little interest in France, and perhaps, but the Chinese, for example, said they will not accept any limits on these systems since they need them to deal with Taiwan contingencies or whatever. And so that treaty is seen as the most vulnerable next. There was some speculation in the U.S. media that the following the recent plutonium agreement withdrawal, that this would be the next treaty we have to withdraw from in order to give it more options to address perceived military contingencies in Europe. So that's when I think people are waiting to see what's going to happen next. There's also a problem with some of the non-nuclear treaties, particularly the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty. That treaty has been in trouble for the last 10 years. As you know, during the Cold War, the NATO and the Warsaw Pact at the end of the Cold War signed an agreement that would limit the number of major weapon systems they had, and those were tanks, helicopters, combat aircraft, artillery pieces. And the treaty was very complex and negotiated because it involved so many countries, but it's been very easy to implement because countries the limits are so high. Everybody's been cutting down way below those limits, at least initially at the end of the Cold War. But unfortunately, the way the treaty was structured, it was block to block, and what you had throughout the 90s and the subsequent decade was that countries were, the Warsaw Pact fell apart, countries were leaving their alliances and alignments with Russia behind, joining the NATO or otherwise developing independent forces, and yet these countries are still being countered against the Russian bloc total. So Hungary, Poland, others joined NATO, but their totals were at the time being countered against Russia. There were also many countries that weren't involved in the original treaty because they didn't exist, and then they came into existence: the Baltic states, the Yugoslav republics, the Czech Slovak Republic split. And so this treaty was clearly outdated. It had some limits on what Russia could do in its flanks as well. So everybody agreed we needed to get a new treaty, and then negotiate a new treaty. It would be basically apply national limits to include, and Russian government supported that, as did the U.S., but the implementation became held up by the parallel issue about Russian conventional military presence in countries outside of Russia's borders, particularly Georgia and Moldova. And when they adopted this revised treaty in the 1989 OSCE summit conference, there also was a parallel commitment made by President Yeltsin to withdraw Russian forces from countries that didn't want them, particularly Georgia and Transnistria. But since then, that hasn't occurred, and the Russian government said this was a political declaration of intent. It's not legally binding and shouldn't be held up the treaty, but NATO has decided not to implement the treaty, not to ratify it until this occurred. And after a while, the Russian government just stopped fulfilling the CFE treaty because it felt that it was, which was correct, it was unfairly impacting Russia. and they demanded initially adoption of the revised treaty. NATO, a few years later, stopped fulfilling it as well, and stopped supplying Russia with the data information. And just last year, the Russian government finally just withdrew from the body that was executing the treaty. So that treaty is pretty dead, and now the Russian position is would not be satisfied with the adopted treaty. There's got to be a new treaty, and then it has to include, and then we go back to the questions, the issues we were talking about a minute ago, which was it's got to include highly advanced conventional forces, it has to include naval systems, and so on. So it becomes very complicated. So you'd have to negotiate more systems among 40, 50 countries, and getting them all to agree who should have what, and how many, and what you can do with them. I think it's just going to be extraordinarily difficult. But that said, so far the CFE, absent CFE treaty, hasn't had much of an impact on the bilateral relationship or even the European security relationship. It would be useful, I think, for some of the regional conflicts, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and so on, but there's not a sense of how we get there. So that's where we are with the main treaties. In terms of nuclear security, that's been in a great attention during the past year. That was one of the key concerns of the Obama administration, to get greater control over nuclear materials that could be diverted to terrorists or diverted to states of proliferation concern. Russia and the U.S. partnered well. Initially, there was the first nuclear summit in Washington in 2002, I think it was, or Obama was like 2000, so it was 2010. President Medvedev came. They also talked about the Kyrgyz crisis. The next summit was supposed to be held in Moscow in 2012, but for whatever reason, the Russian government decided not to host it, so it went to Seoul. And then the summit in 2014 was in the Netherlands. But already by then, the Ukraine crisis had just started, and the last summit, which just occurred in Washington in April, the Russian government decided not to participate formally. There was a lot of fear at the time that Russia would try and orchestrate some kind of boycott of the event, tell the Chinese or the Kazakhs or the Azeris don't participate. That did not occur. Russia, according to the U.S. side, did not interfere at all with execution of the summit. I think the ambassador was sent in as an observer, and so it didn't appear to have any impact on the summit directly. But there's now the question of where we go from here, because the summits have now ended with the Obama administration. They've agreed that the senior officials will continue to meet. There's now a desire to have the further efforts distributed among some institutions, the IEA, Interpol, depends on the institution. But Russia has stated it clearly would prefer to work through the IEA, and the Russian objection to the summits at the end was basically that Russia was not being able to have the impact it felt it deserved, that the Americans, the South Koreans, the Dutch, some of the previous hosts were sort of arrogating decisions themselves. The Russian also objected to this body giving in direction to the IEA or the UN or some other institutions. So we've got to sort out what the next effort will be in going ahead. We've also seen in the last few years a weakening in some of the bilateral cooperation between Russia and the United States in this area. That was even a few years ago when Russia decided not to renew the non-Lugar Framework Agreement. As you know, during what happened in the Cold War, was Russia and the former Soviet states ended up with all this extra nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, even perhaps biological, which they didn't need. And so the U.S. said, we will work with you, and European allies did as well, to eliminate this, put more controls in it. The U.S. provided money, training. And that worked fine for a while, but it was an inherently unequal and therefore unstable process. I mean, in an arms control agreement, Russia and U.S. agreed to have equal limits. They have exchanges, verification. In this, it was the U.S. would give Russia money and send its contracts eliminated, but Russia wasn't really doing the same on the U.S. side, so there was always concern about how that, the appearances, but also inequities in intelligence and so on. And Russia decided in the end it's now committed to do this process itself, as the U.S. does, eliminate and protect its material, and so suspended the cooperation inside Russia. What we had hoped, and it's so far been occurring, but I'm not sure how much longer it will, is that Russia and the U.S. will cooperate now in dealing with loose nuclear material and weapons of mass destruction in other countries. Throughout the last 2 decades, the U.S. and Russia and other countries have been cooperating to take back a lot of the nuclear material, nuclear technology they had distributed during the Cold War throughout the world before the problem of terrorism and securing this nuclear material became evident. And now we're trying to recover any research reactors or the highly enriched uranium fuel that they use that could potentially be used to make nuclear weapons. But most recently, we've also seen some weakening of some of the other bilateral accords. You mentioned the plutonium disposition agreement. There was also cessation, execution of the nuclear, some of the agreement to work on cooperating on next generation research reactors and select company agreements. So far, none of this has had much of an impact. The plutonium disposition agreement, the Russian government said it's not going to use this for weapons. It's still going to eliminate this. The agreement had already been weakened both by Russia and U.S. agreeing to weaken its terms, and also by the U.S. not fulfilling the precise way that the material is supposed to be disposed. So in the U.S., it's just costing a lot more than people had thought to get rid of the material, and the U.S. doesn't really want to use it to make nuclear fuel for conventional or modified reactors. It rather is looking just to bury it somewhere, which is not originally the intent of the agreement. And so I think I'm still not worried about this agreement per se. What does worry me, though, is when President Putin sent the rejection of the decision of the Russian government to cease execution of it to the Duma. There was a series of conditions in there explaining why Russia would want to see to resume this kind of cooperation. And those are really hard to meet conditions. They are, no NATO expansion, end to sanctions. The United States pays some kind of reparation or compensation of Russia, damage inflicted by the sanctions, and there's some others. And those are, if the Russian government tries to apply those to future arms control agreements, I don't think they'd be met or easily by any future U.S. administration. But again, I'm not sure if that's going to happen, and so far it's not been a major issue. Just the regional questions. The Iran nuclear agreement, as far as we can tell, is going well. Russia's performing an important role there and helping make sure that the Iranian nuclear program is transparent, that any fuel that Russia gives to the Bushehr reactor, for example, or helps in building new reactors is returned to Russia rather than left in Iran, where it could be, in theory anyway, made to make nuclear weapons or other dangerous material. China's also cooperating well on that. And so far the differences have not spilled over and impacted that agreement, which is good. But it's a limited duration agreement. There are already differences in the U.S. and Russia over how serious the Iranian ballistic missile testing is in terms of the implications of the agreement. So it's something that will become, I think, increasing concern as the agreement is implemented and after maybe a decade or so, when some of the restrictions disappear or relax, then we're going to have to figure out what to do. But for the moment, as long as there's a continued Russia-U.S. interest in the treaty, which I think there is, execution, as long as we have an Iranian government that supports it, which is, so far so good, but could change, it's not been a major problem. Conversely, North Korea has turned into a terrible problem, but it's not anything that I don't think it's being affected by the Russia-U.S. differences directly. I thought the Russian government made a good effort to try and work some magic in Pyongyang, trying to bring Kim Jong-un to Moscow for the May Day parade last year, trying to basically get the government in North Korea to have a broader understanding of world affairs. I mean, President Putin has always been interested in North Korea. He went there shortly after he became president. But Russia, U.S., as well as everybody else, has just not had any influence in that government. And so we do have some negative blowback in the Russia-U.S. relationship and what the U.S. is doing in response to the North Korean missile and nuclear program. I'm not sure how much damage it's inflicting, in the sense that if it doesn't occur, it wasn't occurring, not sure what else if it would really affect the overall trend. But what's happening, as you know, is that North Korea is periodically testing a nuclear weapon or a long-range missile, and the U.S. then steps up its defenses in cooperation with South Korea and Japan, and that's now including the missile defense system in South Korea, and then the Russian and Chinese governments object because they worry that this system could also negatively affect their security. And it's a classic security dilemma at work. The only way to stop this is to address the cause of the problem, and that's the North Korean government. Now, there are some Russians, mostly though Chinese, who argue that this problem would be easier to solve if there was a change in U.S. policy. I don't know, but so far we haven't seen the Obama administration has not changed its policy, and we haven't seen any indication that the North Korean government has changed its policy. The North Korean government has openly said that they want to be recognized as a nuclear weapon state, like, de facto, if not de jure, so like India or Pakistan, and the U.S. and Russian and Chinese governments all said this is unacceptable. So I'm not going to spend much time on the Middle East or South Asia. Those are clearly proliferation problems, but as long as the Middle East is in total turmoil, it's hard for me to see how we're going to get any kind of WMD or even a nuclear-free zone there. And South Asia, as long as the Indians insist that this is not an issue they want to negotiate with, include Russia or the U.S. in terms of their potential arms racing with Pakistan nuclear, I'm not sure what we can do. But I think that's laid out some of the issues I consider important, but I'm eager to hear yours next, and perhaps we can also talk about the U.S. elections. There's obviously a clear difference between the two candidates on non-proliferation and Russia-U.S. relations, and that will have a lot of impact, I think, more than most U.S. elections in terms of what future opportunities and challenges we're going to face. But for now, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. West. Please ask your questions. I would ask you to introduce yourself, and also please speak to the microphone. Okay, please.
From the New York Times.
Could you speak to the
Oh, sorry.
And we are being recorded, right? So people
yes,
be aware of that.
Streamed to the Russian International Affairs Council website.
Thank you for that summation. I wonder if you could give us your take a little bit on whether or not you think there's a change. You said there's sort of been ups and downs in this arms race, in the change in tenor, because there's a certain sense, and this could be wrong, that when in the Cold War period there was sort of the sense that nuclear weapons were the weapons that dare not speak their name, and everybody sort of knew they had them, but they didn't really talk about them or threaten to use them, and there wasn't an effort to stop. To reduce them, and now, at least twice on the main Russian news channel, there have been threats to use them against the United States, and I wonder how you read that.
Right. The Russian government has been making more explicit references to its nuclear forces than we've seen recently. I remember during the Cold War that you're right, everyone knew about this. It was not kind of the U.S. side which would tend to make more explicit references, such as during the Korean conflict or at other points in terms of defending Germany. But it wasn't in either case. It wasn't clearly what the level we're seeing now. I wouldn't say that the Russian chain explicit references to this has been that recent. It's not been just in the 2 years. I think we saw this since at least maybe 2008, 2009, when there was a lot of concern about the U.S. missile defense activities in Eastern Europe. So even during the Bush administration, there was warnings to countries like Ukraine and Poland and the Czech Republic that if they hosted these missile defense systems, then they were in principle of making themselves potential targets for any Russian counter-strike if there were ever to be a conflict. And this is now, we've seen this extended recently to Crimea with Russian references to deploying nuclear weapons. And I understand why Russia would make these threats, in the sense that that is a capacity Russia has, that one of its attributes is a superpower, and it can perhaps make threats and know that this is going to generate a lot of tension in Washington and Europe, and perhaps the threats can help generate pressure on. I think what might be the Russian hope is that this will put pressure on, for example, European governments to do as we saw during, for example, the Cold War, the Reagan period in particular, pressure on their governments to constrain sanctions or change U.S. NATO policy to reduce the threat. So, yes, we've seen it, and I sort of understand the logic. I'm not sure if it's had much effect yet on any. It's hard for me to see any country that, because of a Russian threat, has changed its policy. There's a lot of concern in Europe and NATO about the deterioration in the overall relationship, but I haven't seen it manifesting itself in references to this is raising the risk of nuclear war with Russia, and therefore we need to roll back the sanctions and so on. I think there's just a general disappointment with the deterioration relationship. There's probably some concern about the little risk arising in nuclear war, but there's even more concern about lost opportunities for cooperation against terrorism or migration and so on. So, yes, this is occurring, but its impact so far has not been that great. Compared to, for example, I still don't see this anywhere near as bad as the Cold War. I remember we actually really did think that a nuclear war was possible, and we were all worried about what could lead to that. Here, it's not manifesting itself in the same way. It's just not really an issue, at least among the policymakers.
Please, next question.
Or comment.
Oh, comment.
If you want to, reply.
Dr. Weiss, using my opportunity to ask a question as well. So you mentioned China is not really taking part in any dialogue in nuclear non-proliferation. What is the position of current U.S. presidential candidates towards this problem? Because so far we haven't read much about that in the media.
Right. China is participating in nuclear non-proliferation issues. It's just not doing them in participating in their arms control. So that's how we get to different. So the Chinese are clearly involved in Iran, and they've been performing a useful function and executing the agreement, working on, for example, modification of the Iraq plutonium reactor. Everybody sees China as the key to resolving the North Korean crisis, though the problem is that the North Korean government doesn't like dealing with China for whatever reason, and so China's influence is a lot less, but still that's something that China and the Russian and U.S. agree in principle needs to be done. And then beyond that, China is participating in the P5 process and the Non-Proliferation Treaty and other areas as a participant, along with France, Britain, and others. But what China does do is it objects to any constraints on its nuclear forces. The official Chinese position is first, Russia and U.S. You go down to our levels or around that, and then we'll consider participating. But until then, you have no right to tell us what to do, since you're and the problem is we don't really know precisely that some things about the Chinese nuclear force, as people like Arbatov here or General Yeltsin point out, that they're in tunnels. We don't precisely know what they have and what they're doing and how good they are, and so it's a bit of a mystery what China's capacity is. There's a good reason why you haven't heard much about the U.S. presidential candidates. I don't recall them saying anything on that issue about China bringing China into arms control. You've heard some talk about the non-proliferation question in Korea, and both Trump and Clinton said they're going to get tough on China and force it to put a lot of pressure on Pyongyang. But that's the current U.S. government position, and I'm not quite sure how we do that and whether that will result in much change. Given, I mean, it's clear that this government in Pyongyang, I don't know what happened, but somehow along the line, Kim Jong-un really took a strong animus to China. So China's influence is going to be limited there, and then China shares the Russian position that it's better to have the current regime, no matter how bad it is, than to risk the possibility of regime change, which could, in theory, lead to mass chaos, refugees, and the U.S. Army moving up to the border with China and Russia. And so that's a fundamental difference we have not bridged. I thought for a while it looked like, and we all hope that the Chinese would decide it would be better to have a unified Korea that looked like South Korea than the current division. Even though it lost the buffer, it would gain a better partner. But that might have been the Chinese thinking a few years ago, but now it's clear they're more concerned about the United States as a potential rival than they are concerned with North Korea that's out of their control. So that's, at the moment, it hasn't come up, and it's not clear, even in the proliferation on where we're going to go from that in terms of cooperation.
Any more questions? Okay, please.
My name is Dmitry, I am an expert, and my question is related to the decolonization program that is going on in the US, and the stances that the presidential candidates have. Well, we know about this 1 trillion over 3 decades, or 350 billion over 10 years. We know that Mr. Trump stated that in terms of nuclear, Russia is new and the US is old, and this is bad. But what is the general understanding in the US? Will one or other presidential candidate shift the priorities in terms of nuclear modernization programs in the US?
Right. Just by way of background, the US and Russian nuclear modernization programs have been out of sync for a while. So the US is very happy with the nuclear arsenal and ended up with the end of the Cold War, and has been cutting it in numbers but increasing its capacity in terms of sophistication, but no major changes. But these systems are beginning to, their lifespan is beginning to fade, and so the US either has to, as the current plan is, to rejuvenate them with the next generation systems, or eliminate broad classes. The most common idea is you eliminate the ground-based missiles and just rely on bombers and submarines. The air component is important for the U.S. because it has a conventional role. So you use the same weapon, the airplanes you use to drop nuclear bombs, you could also use for any conventional conflict. And air power, we know how important it is to United States military operations. And the submarines are thought to be very well protected and useful for second strike, and so you want to do those. The land-based missile is one that's thought to miss. But anyway, the U.S. is correct what you said. The U.S. is now contemplating rebuilding its buying the next generation of nuclear forces in order to keep a strong nuclear force. Russia, at the end of the Cold War, inherited a lot of old Soviet systems, and they've become even older. And so in the last few years has been trying to actually deploy its next generation systems. There were some problems with the nuclear submarine, which appear to have been largely solved. So you've now got a very modern, very accurate and powerful strategic submarine fleet coming online. The air component has traditionally been weak and still remains so. There's some thought given to a fifth generation bomber based on whatever the fifth generation stealth aircraft, the fighter plane, will look like, but it's more on the drawing board. We still haven't seen any active procurement. And then the missiles, Russia has been developing and deploying next generation missiles. So the problem is it's out of sync. So Russia rearmed over the last decade and will continue to do so. based on the fact that its forces were expiring. Now the U.S. forces are expiring, so the U.S. is about to go on. And so the argument people are making is we might be able to not spend all this money, and if we could somehow reach an agreement with Russia, which would reduce sharply or the overall number, or eliminate different types of class of weapon systems. And so that's the pro-arms control people are making that argument and pushing the U.S. government, the Russian government, the U.S. government to agree to these cuts. The other hand, there are those in the U.S. who are very strongly committed to the nuclear modernization, even if the concerns about Russia were met, which they're not. Even if they were, they'd still be concerned about China's potential over the long term. The presidential candidates in public are somewhat guarded. In private, there's some reporting that the Clinton people might cut back on some of this. Thinking in particular is a controversial cruise missile that the U.S. is developing to basically be able to launch nuclear missiles on from an airplane that would launch this cruise missile. And it's not clear. I mean, it's very expensive, and it's not clear if the U.S. needs this capacity given everything else. And so that's where the main argument's coming. Trump, as usual, he said, yes, we're falling behind. It came up in the debate yet, but he's also at times also that he doesn't want to spend all this money on nuclear weapons or missile defenses. He doesn't think it's he just says he doesn't like spending money in particular on many things, and this is one of them. So in actual practice, it's not clear to me what the candidates will do. As I said, they both have given a commitment to claiming a strong U.S. nuclear deterrent, but they've also expressed some concerns about the high costs you've mentioned. And so I don't know what the effect will be on balance in this domain.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm sorry for delay. I missed a lot of the presentation. Of course, everybody knows, paying attention to the ongoing debate in the United States who will become the president. And not in today's night, but the previous debate, Trump mentioned, referring to some military issues, that he has military advisors who like him, who support him. And in your opinion, what will be the advice to Trump from these military people if he will become a president on the question of the nuclear disarmament and the nuclear negotiations with Russia?
That's an interesting question, because the advisors he's listed are not well known except for General Flynn, who was former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And that issue, the nuclear area, is not an issue that General Flynn has spoken much on. He's been more an expert on terrorism. So his advisors' views on terrorism are clear. Really get tough, torture the terrorists if we need to, etc. The nuclear advice is not evident. I don't know what his advisors will tell him. However, Trump himself has spoken on the nuclear question. Even there's some articles you can find if you look online about some comments he was making in the 1990s about this issue, his concern about nuclear proliferation and so on. But his main statement recently and he reaffirmed this in the debate, is that he thinks he's comfortable if other countries, basically he wants to save the U.S. money, right? So he wants to cut back on U.S. military spending for what he sees as other countries. And that means that conversely, he's willing to give them the option of getting their own nuclear forces if they think they need it, rather than have the U.S. pay and put his forces at risk to defend them. In terms of his own view on arms control and so on, he wants to cooperate with Russia. And I imagine that if the Russian government were to say part of an essential component of this cooperation was nuclear arms control, and we wanted to cover this and part of each agreement, I imagine he'd be open to that, because he wants Russia's cooperation against terrorism. And as a person who likes to make deals, he might say, okay, I'll give you some of what you want on the nuclear domain, and you give me what I want on the terrorism domain, and we'll come to some agreement. So he seems to be open to that issue. He hasn't expressed strong statements on the rearmament. Again, he said he wants to save some money, but he's also accused the current administration of not keeping the U.S. Military and the U.S. nuclear deterrence strong enough. Non-proliferation, there were early statements of his about his concern about the issue. There were more recent concerns, as his seeing this as a solution to reduce free riding on the part of other countries. So he's a bit of a mystery on this, what will happen in terms of limitation. Whereas Clinton, I think it's a bit clear. She'll probably continue the rearmament, but perhaps roll back the cruise missile program as not being needed to fulfill for what she sees as her objectives of the program.
Mr. Thomas, please.
My name is Edward Thomas. I work for the Gudzonskого weekly in the Netherlands. One more question on the comparison between the Cold War era and today, if that's all right. Another difference is the extent to which the issue of nuclear arms lives in the mind of the public. The fact that it's less of a public issue today, which is debated amongst a wide percent of people, does it make the situation less or more unstable in your opinion?
Well, I think it's, in a way, it makes it easier for the two governments to either do their own thing or to reach agreements on the issue. I mean, a few years ago, as you know, there was a lot of pressure in Denmark and other countries for NATO to get out of the nuclear business, to remove the nuclear bombs that the U.S. keeps in some NATO countries as not being needed, given the kind of threats that NATO was seen as facing. I mean, NATO did not see a Russia threat in a lot of these countries, but some of them did, so the East Europeans put a lot of pressure not to withdraw the systems. Now there's not a strong pressure either way. I imagine that means the governments can pretty much have a free hand. If you get a Trump administration that considers reaching a really good relationship an important priority, enough sufficient to curb the U.S. military presence in NATO and cut back nuclear forces, there'll be some people in both countries, both Europe and the United States, would oppose that, but I think they could get away with it in the sense that I don't see a strong opposition. Conversely, if the U.S. Were to push for a continued NATO a commitment to being a nuclear alliance, as in the past summit, and continued modernization, there will be some people who object in the arms community and some people object for monetary reasons, but in the whole, I think they could get away with it. So at the moment, the public is not a constraining factor in Europe or the United States. So it means that the options to the governments are more open. And it's not, no one is, I'm aware of, except for, I mean, maybe there are a few, but it's not a major issue in the U.S. presidential elections, the question of U.S. Arms control policy, non-proliferation. So I think it's just basically means they have a largely free hand, and that then depends on the bilateral relationship and some other issues in the multilateral structure.
Any further questions or comments?
I have one more if I can.
Of course, yes.
So I wonder, you, in the beginning of your talk, you sort of said that the start has been, sorry. At the beginning of your talk, you talked about how START was kind of the bedrock of the arms control treaties, and so far that seemed to be remaining strong, and there was interest on both sides in continuing it. But I wonder if you have any concerns, or if the community has any concerns in terms of the willingness to withdraw from pieces like the plutonium agreement, and I know you said elsewhere that it's more a symbolic step than a real threat, but is the willingness to use those treaties as bargaining chips a sign that the central pillar, the START treaties, might be weakened?
Right. In theory, Yes. In theory, if the Russian government has decided it's a good policy to try and force changes in U.S. and European behavior by affecting issues that are of central concern to these countries, at least in the Obama administration, that would include the nuclear issue. And there have been some Russian statements that Russia may need to withdraw from these treaties. They've never, though, been spoken at the highest level. It's always been mid-level officials or analysts. On the U.S. side, you can read commentary saying we need to get out of the START treaty. It's overly constraining the U.S. The U.S. cutting, Russia's not. Or the U.S. needs to be more concerned about other issues. But it's not that strong, and I've not seen any official move at even the congressional level to try and change the currently implemented treaty. It's going to be more of a problem, I think, when we have to get more serious about what comes after this current New START expires. There, as I mentioned, all these differences about which way we should go. The U.S. side's going to say, well, look, the Russia government has been cheating on INF. How do we know they wouldn't cheat on the next START agreement, even if they agree with this one? The Russian government will feel why, perhaps Russia's security is best protected by having a free hand to develop the kind of nuclear forces we think we need to deter a NATO or U.S. threat, or potentially China threat, though they wouldn't say that. So in theory, yeah. So far, though, it's not. It's that the New START is something that's been pretty solid. I think that's the least vulnerable of the edifice I tried to lay out at the beginning. I more worry about perhaps defections regarding Iran, in the case of Russia, or perhaps problems with future nuclear security efforts if the governments can't come to an agreement what should be needed. There's also a problem in that this is a really important issue. Everything we talked about is a really important issue for the Obama people and the Obama team. I'm not sure how important it is for either Secretary Clinton or Mr. Trump. They both stated at the first or the second debate, in which they both said they acknowledge this is the major issue for the U.S., the danger of nuclear weapons coming under terrorism, but it sort of lacked the conviction that I think I see in the Obama team that this is really a major problem, or even under the Bush team. So I wonder if what I'm talking about today is going to be that important for the next team. They may well be concerned about other issues, be it terrorism or China or something else. They could easily decide, if the arms nuclear issue is not that important, then we don't really need a START treaty. Russia can do what it wants, the US can do what it wants, and we can live with that. So that's where I put it. Not worried now, but I do see problems ahead in terms of that treaty follow on.
Yes, please.
One more question. There is a huge issue that remains one of the hurdles between further talks of security in Europe on tactical nuclear weapons is the nuclear sharing within NATO. Is there a possibility that with Rolf Mueller, introduced as one of the chief NATO officials, there may be some shifts in the US stance towards stationing nuclear bombs in European countries?
I would say no under the Obama administration, rest of the Obama administration. There was a lot of thought when the administration first came in about ending that process, at least about pulling U.S. forces, nuclear weapons out of Europe. They were making a strong case that the U.S. should cut back in the number of nuclear weapons it had and how it uses them, that we now have conventional forces, we have missile defenses, we don't really need to have rely so much on nuclear forces. And so there was thinking the administration was going to actually withdraw some of the bombs from some of the countries that didn't want them, at least according to public opinion polls. That could have been Germany, because the German government at the time, before there was a change in coalition, at least the foreign ministry wanted to have them removed. There was evidence that there was some of the political parties and some of the people in Belgium and the Netherlands wanted them out. Turkey was unclear whether Turkey wanted to keep this or not. It somewhat seemed to be related to Iran, and sort of depended who you wanted to talk to. It wasn't well thought out. Italy was also thought not to have a strong opinion on this issue. But Secretary Clinton, it appears, made a decision that this was important, and therefore she was going to push for NATO to keep these systems for a while, and that was the decision. Now, if she's president, I suspect that will continue, because now you can make a stronger case for having this until there's progress, until unless Russia were to agree, maybe not even then, to cut them. And if Trump were president, then it's more complicated, since he has said that he doesn't like the U.S. spending a lot of money to defend NATO countries. He considered NATO useful as far as it deals with terrorism, and he's gone back and forth on whether he thinks they're fulfilling that function. He would probably be open for eliminating the nuclear sharing as we have now. So that could well see a withdrawal of U.S. nuclear bombs from Europe. But he seems to be also open to letting these countries have their own nuclear forces. And so he may, although I've seen no evidence that Germany or Italy or others want to have a nuclear force, he would in principle be open to that. There are perhaps some countries that might want to exercise that option. I suppose that could be Turkey, depending on what happens in the case of Iran. But not many. I mean, the British and the French citizens will stay. So you could have national nuclear forces rather than nuclear sharing. I'm not sure if Russia's more happy with that or not than the current arrangement. So.
Okay, colleagues, does anybody else have questions or comments they want to add? One more?
Yes, maybe one last question. Well, from what I've heard, you and probably the US community have a pretty clear understanding of the issues that Russia and leadership faces, and they understand why the situation is the way it is. Maybe you have some kind of advice, what measures may be taken by the US side, by the Russian side, to go further with the arms control, with the reductions, and with the common understanding of the global processes.
I have some advice. Some of it I haven't been smart enough yet to see a solution to. For example, the conventional forces problem. Because people use these conventional forces for other reasons than the Russia-US balance, and so I just don't know how to deal with some of the objections. My advice to Russia, I'll give one to each government, and we can get more, but is not to worry so much about U.S. missile defenses. Their capabilities are grossly exaggerated in Russia. The problem in the U.S. is we want the Iranians and the North Koreans to think these are really effective weapons so that they won't attack us or develop long-range missiles to threaten us. But we want China and Russia to understand that these systems are not capable and probably just can't be under limits of current technology to really represent the nuclear balance between our countries. So that's what I would recommend to Russia. I would ask that President Putin, as he did in 2002, 2003, when the U.S. withdrew Navy treaty, said, okay, we regret this. We're sorry the U.S. wants to spend all this money in missile defenses, but we don't care. It doesn't really matter to our security. That's what I'd like him to do. I don't think he will, but that's what I'd like him to do. And for the next U.S. president, I would like them to remain as committed to the problem of nuclear material security, nuclear terrorism as the Obama administration. I worry they're not, though, because it's just not their thing. I mean, they seem to be more interested in other issues. And having been at the Pentagon in 2001 and seen the plane hit the building, I was just so surprised, and that showed me how little I knew about the world. And so I worry that there's going to be some other surprise we need to prepare for. And the one that we obviously need to worry most about is some kind of nuclear terrorism incident. So those are the two things I would most say. I'm here actually to learn more, to try and look for more openings for cooperation for the next team in the U.S. and Russia. But those are the two that I really would like to push if I could. I can pick one for each.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wайтца, for a very interesting lecture, and colleagues, thank you very much for the discussion. I think it was very interesting and productive, and as I mentioned before, if you miss something, you can have a look at the video at the Russian International Affairs Council website. I think and the dialogue on nuclear disarmament so far has been very productive in Russian-US relations, and I can only hope that it continues further and continues to set a good example for the other Russian-US relation topics.
Yeah, and I'm open to continuing dialogue by email. My email is, it's just my last name Wайтza at HudsonInstitute.org. And I think particularly after the U.S. elections, I think we can think a little more concretely about what might be possible and where we want to go. At the moment, there are just clear differences between the candidates for what they want to do with our nuclear arms control and Russia-U.S. relations. And so it's kind of hard to until we know that outcome. But once we do, I think whoever it is, they're going to undergo an extensive review of Russia policy and arms control policy. And I think that's when we can have a lot of influence in terms of what are we write and what we say in shaping that agenda. So that's when I think I'd like to re-engage with everybody if we can.
Thank you very much.
I was going to talk a bit with Neil. If you have any questions.